Hey, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Morning Musings. Happy Friday morning to you. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And we are continuing our examination, our review and refutation of the book, Hope Resurrected, by Mr. Lance Conley, who is a former preterist. Now, as I pointed out to you in the last video, on Facebook, and more exchanges than I can count, Mr. Conley has argued that the absolute foundational killer argument against full preterist theology is the doctrine of the election. He says preterists have no answer for it. We cannot answer it. Therefore, it is a death knell to full preterism. Now, you have to understand that Mr. Conley holds a very distinctive view of election himself. He is of the Eastern Orthodox faith, and while he believes in election, he certainly believes in a different shade of election from the Reformed community. You know, the Reformed community, that view of election says you were predestinated to salvation and you cannot lose it. Well, Mr. Conley says on page 91, can you lose election status? The answer is yes. The Bible emphatically teaches free will and that the election is open to all people until Christ returns. So Mr. Conley stands at diametric odds against the Reformed view of election. That, of course, is a different discussion. He can discuss that with his Reformed friends, who would, of course, consider him basically a heretic for rejecting Calvin's view of election and predestination. So we have the situation that Mr. Conley accuses preterists of being heretics for our view of election, but Calvinists would accuse him of being a heretic for his view of election. Ironic, is it not? But the basic underlying presupposition of Mr. Conley's view of election is that election ends at the second coming. Now remember, Mr. Conley believes that the second coming is at the end of human history. Now, if the doctrine of the end of human history, the end of time, if the concept of no more evangelism and thus no more salvation from sin, if that were true, well then guess what? Mr. Conley would have a point. And look, I used to believe in the, quote, end of time doctrine. I used to believe that at the second coming of Christ, you know, the earth and the cosmos are destroyed. And there's no more evangelism. There's no preaching. There is no more invitation to come into Christ to be cleansed. I used to believe that. I used to teach it. Pardon me. Trouble of it is, that's not a biblical doctrine. I came to realize that the Bible affirms in more ways than can be counted that the kingdom of Christ, established among men on earth to call men to Christ from sin, is affirmed to be without end. That's what the gospel of Jesus Christ is all about. That's what the kingdom of Christ is all about. Neither the gospel nor the kingdom were ever predicted to become what I will call museum pieces. For people to say, oh look, do you remember the time a gazillion years ago in which the gospel was preached to save people from sin? Now, we all know the gospel doesn't do that anymore, and no one's invited to come into Christ anymore. But oh, look at the gospel. Wasn't that a marvelous thing? Oh, and look at the church. Look at the church. You know, the church, my goodness, it served the Lord on earth, and then it was taken off the earth, or the earth was renovated and the church is living on earth. Oh, but no evangelism, you see. No such thing as sinners. No such thing as the gospel calling them out of sin. That's Mr. Conley's view of the, quote, eschaton, of the time of the end. That's why he believes that election ends at the coming of the Lord. Now, what's absolutely fascinating to me is that in his affirmations of the end of election, and in his affirmations of the so-called time of the end, all he does is give a scripture reference. He engages in not one syllable, not one keystroke of actual exegesis. He says, and he tells us, well, you know, in Romans chapter 11, 25 to 27, Paul taught that when the full number of the Gentiles is saved, that election is over. Well, that's not what Paul said in the first place. Romans 11, 25 to 27 is considered by Mr. Conley to be absolutely, you know, it's his key text, really, in an awful lot of ways. And I'll be looking at Romans chapter 11, 25 to 27 later on as we continue in our refutation. But for now, I want us to examine just a few of the biblical texts. Now, I shared with you Isaiah 9, 6 and following last week, of the increase of his government. That's evangelism. There shall be no end. I shared with you that the great majority of translations render it that way. I shared with you the great majority of commentators render it that way. I shared with you that Hebrew linguists render it that way. But that's not all we have, you see. I want you to look at Matthew chapter 24 and verse 35. Here Jesus is predicting the destruction of the old covenant age, the age that the temple at Jerusalem represented. What age did the temple at Jerusalem represent, folks? It did not represent the Christian age. It did not represent the new covenant or the new covenant age. It did not represent the gospel. It represented the age of Moses and the law. You know, it's amazing that some former preterists are saying there was never such a thing as the age of Moses or the Mosaic age. And they were saying for a while, no such thing as a Christian age until recently, just recently, one of them messed up and he forgot himself and he said the Christian age began with the appearance of Christ. Well, if there's a Christian age, then there was a Mosaic age. The age designated by, characterized, identified by the law of Moses. Oh, but that's another discussion, basically. So in Matthew chapter 24, Jesus is talking about the destruction of the old covenant temple and the end of the old covenant age. And he says, Matthew chapter 24 and verse 35, heaven and earth shall pass away. Now, I understand that people believe that he was predicting the end of literal physical heaven and earth. I believe that's a miscalculation. I believe that's a misinterpretation. He is talking about the destruction of the temple. The temple itself was called heaven and earth by Josephus, the first century priestly Jewish historian. He knew what they called the temple, and they called it heaven and earth. And here is Jesus predicting the destruction of heaven and earth, but my word. Now, what is Jesus' word? Well, Jesus' word in context obviously is not the old covenant age, because the old covenant age was destined to pass away. It was supposed to pass away. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words, that's the gospel. Well, what is the gospel? Well, the gospel means good news. It can mean in different contexts very specific things, but one of the meanings, one of the definitions of the gospel is the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Let me ask you a question. Is the resurrection of Jesus Christ a temporary message? Is the message of a man who came and who said he came to give life, everlasting life. Oh, and no, he did not come to give it to Israel only. That all men might know God. All men, not some, not just few, but that all men of every nation, every kindred, every tongue, everyone might know him and serve him. So Jesus was saying that his word, the gospel, well, what is the gospel again? The gospel is the message of Jesus Christ, death, burial, resurrection, with the invitation for men to come to know the power of that resurrection life. You know, it's stunning that anyone could even possibly say that the resurrection from the dead of Jesus could have meaning for only a few people. I mean, that's literally just stunning. Do all men not experience, quote, death, unquote? Yes. Do all men sin? Yes. Men sinned before Torah. Men sinned before the law of Moses. Man was condemned for sin before the law of Moses and before Israel ever existed. Since all men sinned before the law and before Moses, then they fall under the rubric of all men sinned, and the wages of sin is death, and the need for salvation from that sin. Because you see, sin was not defined exclusively by Torah. Sin has always and ever been defined as a violation of the heart of the eternal, unending God. So the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is the message and proclamation of his death and his burial and his resurrection, has application for any man, every person who has ever sinned and who needs redemption from sin, whether those under Torah or those not under Torah. Those under Moses, those not under Moses. Whether the Greeks who were not of Israel, not of the lineage of Israel, or of Israel. The gospel of Jesus Christ was for salvation to the Jew first and then to the Greek. The Greeks were not Israel. Israel was not the Greeks. Look at John 7:35. So what's the point here? Jesus said, heaven and earth will pass away. My word, that's the gospel, for all men will never pass away. That means it will never cease to function. By the way, the Greek of Matthew chapter 24 and verse 35 is extremely emphatic. Jesus used a double negative, will by no means pass away. Well, if the gospel were to ever cease to function, then it would pass away. Because you see, when the law of Moses ceased to function, it passed away. For Jesus, passing away doesn't mean the burning of a book. Doesn't mean the disappearance of words off of a page. To pass away meant to pass out of application, to pass out of meaning, to pass out of function. That's what pass away meant. And Jesus said, my word will never pass away. Well, listen, if Christ's word, the gospel, calling any man, calling every man out of sin into Christ, if that never passes away, if it never ceases to function, then guess what? Mr. Conley's book, actually the entirety of his book, the entirety of it is false. Because if the gospel of Christ never ceases to function, never loses its application of calling men to God, if it never ceases doing that, and that's what Jesus affirmed in Matthew 24:35, then guess what? Romans 11:25 through 27 doesn't mean what Mr. Conley claims it does. Hebrews 9:28 doesn't mean what Mr. Conley claims that it does. 1 Corinthians 15 doesn't mean what Mr. Conley says it does. Folks, listen to me. If the gospel of Christ never ceases to function, then Mr. Conley is wrong. Flat, dead, wrong, and cannot be resurrected. So Mr. Conley has to prove that in direct opposition, 180 degrees opposed to Jesus, Mr. Conley must prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the gospel of Christ will indeed pass away, that it will indeed cease to function. It will indeed vanish in the sense of being no longer functioning. But that's to deny the very words of Jesus himself. Okay, thanks so much for joining me for this morning's morning musing. You have a fantastic weekend. Please be safe. We'll see you next Monday.